good evening and welcome to the online panel discussion entitled Balkans on Fire. Big question mark, I have to say. Political and security dilemma in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo and Western responses. My name is Vedran Žihić. I'm senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. This panel discussion is organized by the OIIP. This is the abbreviation for the institute, and in cooperation with Austrian Ministry of Defense. The plan was originally to have Wolfgang Petric address us at the beginning with few sentences. It might be that he will join us later, or I see him here. So Wolfgang has joined us through the other channel. Wolfgang, I will give you the Zoom floor in a second. Let me just say one or two sentences for the introduction, introduce the panel, and then Wolfgang Petric, director of our institute, is going to address us with one or two thoughts on this important topic that we want to discuss today. So unfortunately, the topic of today's discussion is more than relevant and hot, so to say, to put it in the quotation marks. The events last Sunday, the violent military attack on the Republic of Kosovo, one policeman killed, another one injured, and the events that unfolded in the last few days, including, I mean, I would say a very interesting and harsh narrative on the side of the Serbian government, including more and more information coming up about the background of this violent attack and various forms of Western reactions. I mean, that all basically points at the fact that we have a situation in the Balkans that is as challenging as it can be. The same goes for Bosnia and Herzegovina. Luckily, no violent conflicts in Bosnia and Herzegovina so far, but the political crisis has been prolonged for a while, and there is almost no day that we don't hear threats of secession and reports about the political stalemate internally, challenging the international community, etc., etc. So I think there is a lot to discuss and to put on the table. We have an interesting and important panel today. Let me just quickly introduce the panelists and then hand over to Wolfgang Petric. First of all, let me introduce Donika Emini. Donika is Executive Director of the Civic Costs Platform and member of Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group. Donika is right now joining us from Pristina, Kosovo, and we are very keen to hear, Donika, how you see this situation. Instead of Majda Ruge, she needed to cancel in the last second due to family-related issues, but we are very, very happy to have Sabina Čudić in the panel. She is member of the National House of Representatives in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She's also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and an experienced politician and foreign policy expert, I would say, from Naša Stranka. Welcome, Sabina, and if I'm not mistaken, you are joining us from Sarajevo. Adi Čerimagić, senior analyst of the European Stability Initiative, AZ, has just landed to Berlin. He is traveling a lot, but he found time to join us today. He's sitting in Berlin and has obviously, as I know you, Adi, a lot to share about recent events, but also the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And last but not least, I'm very happy to welcome Stefan Lehne, experienced diplomat, right now senior fellow at Carnegie Europe. We just met together in Belgrade a few days ago and spent the day together on this day of mourning on Wednesday. And I think it will be very interesting. It will be very interesting, Stefan, to hear your thoughts on the Western responses to the current situation in the Western Balkans. So without further ado, I'm going to just try to let Wolfgang Petric, as I told you, he is president of the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, also president of the Marshall Plan Foundation, senior diplomat for the Republic of Austria, and someone who rightly is labeled as Mr. Balkan in Austria, but also in the European Union. So Wolfgang, I'll try to let you in to address us with one or two first remarks, and then I'm going to hand over to Donika. Do you hear us, Wolfgang?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. We also want to see you.
All right. Very sorry that I'm late, but maybe I have some news for you, because I just attended a briefing about the situation in Kosovo on the border, and there are claims that yes, the Serbian army is there, but they do not have ammunition there, whatever this is worth for. Yeah, but I think it's the usual bad news from the region, which kind of frustrates us. I think we need to be more concerned about this ritual that has been established over the years, the European Union mediation, obviously, and supported by the United States, is not really doing what actually we were expecting to do. And my own experience is if a mediation, if negotiations go on for too long, and I'm not thinking just of the Middle East conflict, there is a certain point where success is not any longer around, and I think we really need to think about how to reformulate, readdress, so to speak, the challenges before us there. Here, I mean, in particular, of course, the European Union. I'm very glad that my dear friend Stefan is part of it, and all the others I, of course, also know in some way or another. It is really, and this is my last sentence, it seems to be and I'm not referring to the Bermudas, I'm referring to the Balkans triangle, that peace, normalization has been sunk somewhere in this triangle between Belgrade, Pristina, and Sarajevo. So it is a very timely exercise, and I'm very glad, Vedran, that you have taken this on and invited such a stellar group of discussants. And of course, I'm really looking forward to listening to you. And so again, I would like to thank you and hand over to Vedran.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. So luckily, or I mean, unfortunately, we are not in the Bermudas Triangle, but in the Balkans Triangle, which is really troubling and making a lot of troubles and problems these days. So let's first move to one corner of this triangle and see, basically, Donika, this is my question to you, from Pristina's position. First of all, what do we know by now? I mean, we have seen tweets of the Kosovo Prime Minister presenting evidence of Serbian involvement into the attacks last Sunday. So first of all, it would be great if you could address the question, what do we know? Then secondly, what is unknown, what is still to be established about the events, and just a kind of a possible reflection of the situation right now. So what do you expect for the next few days to happen?
Thanks, Vedran. Good evening. It's my pleasure to join this discussion from Pristina. I actually came from Ukraine, and it is actually sad to see that, you know, the feeling of war. I'm just around, you know, the corners of the EU, not even the corner. It feels very different reality from what you have in Vienna and in other capitals. I'm happy to be here with Wolfgang, Sabine, and Stefan, and of course, Adi. Thanks for having me. Well, if we say we are surprised, then, you know, we wouldn't be sincere, because it has been the questions, especially since, you know, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So like everybody was thinking, okay, what is going to happen to security safe soft spots in the Balkans, and that's of course Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And obviously, nothing happened. We have at least hoped for some EU sort of stronger, at least approach towards Serbia, being the only country that hasn't joined the EU and other countries in sanctioning Russia, but also in sort of trying to bring a new approach towards the Brussels dialogue, especially because that is something that was pressing even before the war in Ukraine. The question now is not what do we know, because things are coming out every day, especially after they have raided the house of Radojcic in the northern part of Kosovo. Obviously, there is a lot of evidence that has been resurfacing, and it really links. Just the presence of Radojcic there, because I've been hearing a lot of member states saying that unless there is a direct link to Serbian government or to hire Serbian representatives, then we can't do anything. But Radojcic is the link. Radojcic is not only the link to Belgrade, but it's also like one of the leaders of Lista Srpska, which is the main Serbian party in Kosovo, monopolizing Serbian representation in Kosovo institutions. So it is institutionalized paramilitary, criminal sort of a person that is infiltrated in all this. What happened in Pristina, in the northern part of Kosovo, shouldn't be a surprise, because this is the most concerning thing. We constantly bring out the question where there is Serbian army, if they have ammunition, heavy artillery or not, if it's some Serbian gendarmerie. But what we should worry really about is the Serbian paramilitary forces, because these traditionally have been the problem in the Western Balkans. We all know that which is not going to employ army or gendarmerie, because that would definitely mean direct confrontation with NATO, and that is not a smart step to do, especially now. But these paramilitary forces can seriously deteriorate the situation on the ground, which then brings me to my next point, which is there is no such thing as controlled tension, because this is something that I've constantly heard from the EU, because we have sort of normalized this escalate to de-escalate exercise coming from Balkan stabilitocrats. Adi and Sabine will talk more about Dodik, but that we at some point forget that every time they actually do this exercise, it goes one step further. And in this case, I think in Kosovo, the conflict is inevitable. It is inevitable because what has happened is being emotionally used widely, not only in Serbia. You mentioned the day of mourning, and I'm thankful I wasn't really, there, because I had to cancel my Belgrade trip because of the situation on the ground. But also because, emotionally, this issue is being highly used by Serbia on the local Serbs, which can, anytime can have a reaction. And on the Kosovo side, on the Albanian side in Kosovo, obviously, it feels like the war has never been closer. And I have never heard people talking more about the war, the need for mobilization, for need to actually join the forces and even join the Kosovo police if they have to. What bothered me here is that not only there is this sort of reluctance to actually link it to Serbia, but also to sort of start deflating the role of Russia in here, because obviously this has been very carefully done, and there are no direct links to Russia yet. But obviously we know that these elements have been present since the beginning. Also, my last point in this initial intervention is, what did the EU and NATO do? What didn't the NATO do was share information and prevent this, because it was a couple of months ago when a British MP actually went out and she said that there is ammunition being accumulated at this monastery. And what happened is that NATO put it under the rug. So there was a statement coming from KFOR completely sort of ignoring the situation on the ground and just trying to sort of hope that nothing's going to happen there without sharing information. Now there is complaint among NATO and EU member states that there wasn't information that has been shared among partners, which shows vulnerability in the NATO presence, especially in the northern part of Kosovo. The second one is that what NATO should do is just, for the time being, to sort of just support with intelligence, but also strategically the Kosovo police in the north, because Kosovo police in the north has basic problems operating. First of all, they can only provide or control the main roads. They cannot control the forest, and that's why many of the attackers actually managed to escape back to Serbia very, very fast. The second one is support them strategically, because it is in Vucic's agenda to actually escalate the situation to the point that NATO takes over completely the northern part of Kosovo, thus asking the Kosovo police, but also Kosovo presence in the north to actually be withdrawn. This means that if this is happening, then the northern part of Kosovo will be completely out of control of, obviously, Kosovo authorities, but also Serbia. It will be like an international protectorate sort of territory under which then we will have to negotiate differently in Brussels. And then, like even a potential, I don't know, like land swap or an idea of, Kosovo being divided or between Serbia or even Albania. I mean, there are different scenarios in which it can go wrong, might happen. What the EU can do, I mean, obviously, Lajcak's reactions were ridiculous. I mean, they were weak. They screamed weakness, and this is something that was concerning. There was, meeting in Brussels with Escobar, and like the tweet sounded like, so vague, so lukewarm, like they were just, continuing or aiming to continue this business as usual, completely forgetting about the situation on the ground and how serious the situation is. So they keep insisting on some sort of negotiation, some sort of implementation of whatever that hasn't been signed actually in Brussels and then in Ohrid, hasn't been really agreed because Vucic did not agree to it, and then we don't know where to go from here. The last point is, the Kosovo government has managed to sort of manage the situation mildly, quite well, but now there is this big question mark: where do we go from here? I mean, because it is obvious that now, whatever that the Kosovo government was saying, flagging, it is there. There is Radojicic linked to paramilitary forces, challenging security on the ground, trying to create a completely new, different sort of situation on the ground in the north. Challenging not only Kosovo authorities, but also security in Kosovo, but also in the region. But where do we go from here? Do we talk about the association? Do we take over the discussion? How do we bring the local Serbs close to us? How do we engage with local Serbs, especially after the latest attacks? Because now it's completely polarized, and it feels like we have completely lost them. And then how do we manage this sort of post Sunday situation? And this is still unknown because we are still in the process of gathering facts, of trying to convince member states that there are links to state elements in Serbia. Whether it's Vulin, whether it's Vucic, then it really depends on how the situation will unfold. And to just send one message that sanctioning Kosovo constantly as the weakest party in the dialogue and appeasing autocrats brought us here. We should never, and then we should stop appeasing autocrats, but also having this feeding stabilitocrats who are willing to give us just a tiny sort of feeling of security, albeit very short term, and ignoring the long-term consequences. And this is something that all of us in this panel have said it many times, and no one actually listened to us. And this is something that has to be changed. And this is a last call, because, as I said, conflict is inevitable. Whether it will happen in the ranks of armies, or it will be something of similar to what happened in Banjska, on Sunday, we don't know, but it is inevitable.
Thank you so much, Donika. Just a quick follow-up question. So you mentioned basically the sanctions or the measures against Kosovo. They are still in place. Now we saw today Edi Rama and Prime Minister of Croatia Plenković arguing for introducing sanctions against Serbia. So there are basically just right now talks, obviously in Germany, Brussels, etc., etc. And once the facts are established, we could expect this next step. So what is your immediate expectation? Do you expect the sanctions and the measures against Kosovo to be lifted soon, or do you expect any kind of new sanctions against Serbia in the immediate future so that they find themselves on the equal footing? So what's your take on this one? Just a quick one.
Unfortunately, none of it will happen. I mean, obviously, the sanctions against, I mean, they call it measures towards Kosovo are not going to be lifted. They are not necessarily linked to the events in Banjska. There are, a set of requirements that Kosovo government has to do, and that is withdrawing Kosovo police, which is now very unlikely to happen after the situation, post-Sunday situation, obviously. The second one is the withdrawal of 4, Albanian mayors from the four municipalities in the north. So, this is linked to only that, and it doesn't have to do. And the EU, made it clear to the Kosovo government that, we are not going to negotiate the current measures. As we speak, there are no normal meetings happening between the EU and the Kosovo government. They are only allowed to take place if the situation in North Mitrovica, in northern part of Kosovo, is being discussed, is being put into question. So basically, there is even lack of communication on other issues. There is only just conflict sort of prevention mode. On the other hand, only 10 member states out of 27 actually declared, but it's important because we have France and Germany in this group, has declared that if there is proof that there is direct link to the government in Serbia, then we can consider sanctions. First, what do they consider direct link? Because, I mean, having Radojic there, having cars from the Serbian MUP being, there, having them being trained in compounding, as, the footage shows, is not, evidence enough, then I don't know what else we can bring. On the other hand, even if this is proven, then, okay, let's talk about the Hungary question. Will there be, consensus among member states to actually, sanction Serbia? And then the last question is, do they really care? I mean, Kosovo is being sanctioned since June, but yes, I mean, there is a lot. If you ask me, there is, it is very problematic because there is funds, there is cooperation, there is reforms and all, but life goes on. If that happens to Serbia, then will it really matter? That's really, the big question mark, which I also had, when the EU sanctioned Belarus, because you constantly invest in something and then all of a sudden you just leave and then, you kind of have nothing, no presence in these countries. So this is, very problematic. Sanctions might, be even imposed towards, Serbia, but then what's going to be the next step? Then there will be probably no dialogue, and there is nothing. I mean, the dialogue is weak. It is problematic, but it's still there. If it's not, then are we going to talk about, the Balkans in the 90s, fully securitized, and we're just going to talk about, how to prevent wars and conflicts, and nothing else is going to happen? So that's, kind of a tricky situation that the EU hopefully is taking seriously.
Thank you so much, Donika, for this first take. I mean, we will certainly, towards the end of the discussion, come back to all these issues and try to see what the West can and should do. Before I ask Sabina and Adi to explain a bit potential links between the crisis and conflict in Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and before we go a bit deeper into the Bosnian constellation of crisis, which is also quite difficult and challenging, I would just ask Stefan now for a brief view and perspective, basically, as someone who is a very experienced diplomat who was accompanying Javier Solana, who has experienced a lot of similar crises, basically. So, Stefan, I mean, we were in Belgrade together. You just got an impression of how Belgrade and official Belgrade basically reacted to the events. The stakeholders. So what is your take? What is unfolding in front of our eyes, and how would you basically refer to what Dodik just said regarding the West and the weaknesses, etc., etc.?
Thank you. I believe that the events in Kosovo, they fit the pattern, don't they? Because if Vladimir Putin doesn't like to see Ukraine anymore, he invades it. If the Azeri government doesn't want to have an Armenian minority with autonomy on its territory, then it invades the territory. So this is the kind of thinking in the geopolitical world, basically. Might makes right. More governments think that way. And basically, the type of thinking that was behind the events of last Sunday fits the same pattern, basically. I don't believe, and Dodik is definitely right on this, that Vučić has any interest in invading Kosovo. He doesn't want to go to war with NATO. But what I think is quite plausible, given the amount of weapons that were found, is that there were preparations underway for an armed uprising directed by sort of partly political, partly criminal groups. But I think very obviously, and Dodik has referred to it, with some kind of link to the Serbian security structures. There is no question about it. I think the idea was that possibly such an uprising could gather steam and lead to a situation that would even be very hard to control for KFOR. And that might eventually result in a sort of de facto partition of Kosovo. I think this is, in my mind, the most plausible explanation of what was going on. I think what needs to happen now in the first instance is quite clearly that to make absolutely sure that this thing cannot happen. And therefore it's a very good thing that KFOR is being reinforced. And I think KFOR and the Kosovo police has to be much more proactive in actually controlling the situation on the ground in the north, to make sure to confiscate any weapons caches that might be already there, to make sure that these events don't repeat themselves, right? This is the first step, and that's based on a necessary cooperation between KFOR, primarily ULEX, and also the Kosovo authorities. But the second step, I think, must be that this kind of anarchist situation in the north of Kosovo has to be ended. I think we need a Kosovo police that also includes Serbs. We need a judiciary in which also the Serbian population participates. We need an administration that is representative of the composition of the population. So this is hugely difficult to do at this stage because there is no trust between the two sides and the communication is really dead at the moment. But I don't see any alternative. If there is not a genuine effort, and this I think the Kosovo government also has to do more than it has done so far, then I think this region will remain a source of instability for the whole region, basically, for a very long time. I think you asked about the responses of the international community. I would, as you know, I think in the last few months, Kosovo has been in the doghouse. The US and the EU have been very angry about the number of actions that the Kosovo government has taken. I think the most serious one was to install the mayors that were elected by 2% of the voters through a show of force, which I think did create quite a bit of damage and contributed to the escalation of the situation. But of course now, with the events of last Sunday, the Western attitude shifted quite a lot. I think this was clearly a moment of truth where the tendencies to accommodate Vučić in order to make him less supportive of Russia in the Ukraine context, this has to be ended. And I think there needs to be a much more forceful and much more clear-cut position of the EU and the US in condemning these events and to impress on the leadership in Serbia that this must not, under any circumstance, happen again. I think Donica has referred to the dialogue. She said it's a weak dialogue, and it's true, it's quite weak. And the reason why it has been so weakened is that the European perspective, both for Kosovo and Serbia, is extremely weak too. I think people in the region, in both countries, have lost faith in this destiny, and that of course reduces tremendously the leverage that the EU and the US, it supports the EU line on this, can exercise. So what I find interesting, and we've discussed this in Belgrade, I do believe that the candidate status for Ukraine has changed the picture. I think there is a new dynamism on enlargement. I'm convinced that this also offers a new opportunity for the Western Balkan countries to move forward. But in the discussions we had with our colleagues from BPAC in Belgrade, I didn't have the impression that this kind of message has arrived yet, because the people have been so disappointed and are now also quite cynical about the EU future of their countries, that it's difficult for them to convince that it could be otherwise. But I do genuinely believe that opportunity is there. And I think in a way that the most, in a more sort of macro perspective, the most constructive thing that could happen is if 2 or 3 countries, Montenegro, Albania, North Macedonia, move forward in a decisive way with a lot of support from the European Union. I think that would be sent the strongest message to Vučić that his policies are leading absolutely nowhere, and the strongest message also to the Serbian population. So I do believe that the combination of fairly forceful action on the ground in controlling the situation immediately, a genuine attempt to rekindle the dialogue and make it more serious again, together with the renewed perspective of actually making progress towards the European Union, can turn this situation around.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for this assessment, and also putting it at the broader kind of horizon of the EU enlargement, which is going to keep us busy 2024 for sure. And we are heading towards the European Council's summit in Granada, where this is going to be on the agenda. But unfortunately, probably also Balkans in dealing with the crisis. I just wanted to say before I hand over to Sabina and Adi that we invited a colleague from Belgrade. He unfortunately could not join us today, so it would have been interesting to see the perspective, the debates happening right now. But just 1 or 2 quotes from someone who I appreciate a lot, Igor Bandovic. He is director of the Belgrade Center for Security Politics. He just today had a public appearance at N1, the regional TV show, and he said basically that he believes and assumes that a certain type of connection between Serbia and Serbian state and events in Banjska will be established. And he is claiming basically that Serbia, if this is really the case, and if the link can be established, that Serbia is going to go into strong isolation, that autocracy is going to win in terms of pace and velocity inside of Serbia, that the pressure on the opposition is gonna be much stronger, and that basically the West will start treating Serbia similarly to Belarus, which obviously is kind of a big question mark given what Donika just said, this tendency of appeasement of Vučić instabilitocracy. And speaking about Donika, your thesis and this kind of a strong hypothesis of appeasement of autocrats, and basically that the process of appeasement always leads into more conflicts, basically, and tensions. I think that leads us immediately to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And if there is a local politician and autocrat that has been appeased the most, that's probably Milorad Dodik in Republika of Srpska. And I mean, Milorad Dodik's behavior resembles a bit Vučić's behavior now in Kosovo. So basically setting a fire and claiming to be a boss of the fighter brigade at the same time. Which is always this kind of a tendency of setting 1 step, 2 steps ahead, 1 step back, but basically playing or hedging between different geopolitical powers like Russia, China, and the West. And my question are, I mean, Sabina or Adi, I know who wants to go first, but I would like to ask probably Sabina first and then Adi, you. So Sabina, one part of the question would be basically, how do you see the possible repercussions of what just has happened in Kosovo on Bosnia and Herzegovina? Because Wolfgang Petich at the beginning introduced this kind of Bermuda's Triangle, and I think it's quite obvious to think about different parts of the region and hotspots as communicating vessels. And we do know that Belgrade has a strong stake, but also Russia in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Republika of Srpska. So do you see any possible repercussions, and do you see basically any trend in the Western approach towards Bosnia and Herzegovina, any trend of changing policies, adjusting policies now that things have started to change in Kosovo? And secondly, basically from the internal point of view, your party is part of the new coalition on the state level. I mean, and Dodik is part of this state coalition too. But how would you just see this kind of a constant play of, you know, rhetoric of crisis, threatening secession, hopes on the West that Dodik is going to cooperate, and basically your hopes within the coalition that things can start to change and deliver reforms, European integration, rule of law, etc., etc. So, two probably big questions, but if it would be interesting to have your take from Sarajevo and from someone who is a politician in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Those are $1 million questions, but let's get to it then. Well, I guess there are two issues that analysts and politicians often approach. I mean, similarity in approaches is that we sometimes, particularly as academics, those who have some experience in academia and analysts, we tend to look for maybe most creative approaches to and creative theories to defining what happened, simply for the sake, usually as academics, wishing to be published or bring something new to the table. And this sometimes comes at the cost of, I guess, the answer and the outcome itself, because we tend to abandon the simple questions for the more kind of creative and novel ones. And number two, we tend to speak in passive terms, and this is particularly true for politicians, and kind of distant passive terms. Trust needs to be restored, the dialogue needs to be restored, as if these are some kind of processes that are entirely independent of us, and that we are somehow passive observers acknowledging what needs to happen. But I would like to push us kind of back in the direction of simple questions and simple answers. So when we quote the Serbian analyst that you just quoted and say, if some link is found between the Serbian government, and I expect some link to be found between the terrorist attack in Kosovo and the Serbian government, where the link was immediately established by the Serbian government itself, because if this had nothing to do with Serbia, obviously you wouldn't have day of mourning both in Serbia and Republika Srpska, and you wouldn't see the amount of panic in the Serbian government to cover its tracks. So in a sense, we are asking questions that we already know the very basic, very simple, very obvious, painfully obvious answers to. When it comes to the parallels, I'll get to them, but let me just address a couple of things. When we say that we woke up in a new reality, I woke up in Berlin on the day of when the Russian tanks rolled into northern Ukraine. Everybody kept saying we woke up in a new reality, and people kept calling me also on Saturday saying, oh, we woke up in a new reality and Serbia is attacking Kosovo. And there is nothing new about it. I mean, in the case of Ukraine, we got the American intel for months to come. It was practically announced within hours of when it would happen, but we were still somehow, despite all the intelligence we had, we were shocked. And we continue to be shocked both in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Serbia and Kosovo. I guess it's easier to live that way without assuming that our worst fears would materialize. In my opinion, by Saturday afternoon, Mr. Lajčák should have resigned. I think he lost all credibility in this process. And I think he damaged it and lost credibility in the meantime. But when it comes to the question of, and I think the question we hear a lot these days is, how is this aiding Vučić in the moment, in a particular moment, delicate moment when he had all the support that he probably couldn't have dreamed of 2 years ago from the European Union and from Washington? My answer is exactly that he was encouraged by the amount of support he had, and he just needed the last piece of the puzzle is to create an incident, potentially hostage crisis in northern Kosovo, and based on that, to have a blitzkrieg and essentially occupy northern Kosovo and proclaim what he's already been negotiating with his European partners and Mr. Lajčák, which is the Association of Serbian municipalities. So, in a sense, it was exactly this policy of appeasement and moving from passive support to active support that encouraged Vučić to fully conduct, and there is no doubt in my mind that he stands behind this 100%. Back to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Let's go back 2 years ago when Mr. Escobar comes to visit federal parliament at the time when I was the member of the federal parliament prior to being elected to the national parliament. And for a second, I thought that Mr. Escobar forgot what country he is in because, we travel a lot. Sometimes we wake up in a country that we thought was a neighboring country and so on, because he was essentially giving a speech to members of federal parliament of Bosnia and Herzegovina on what a great and magnificent factor of stability Mr. Vučić is, and how important Open Balkans is, and for Bosnia to actively join it. So both in closed meetings and open meetings, we heard a lot of this. And by the way, when certain ambassadors, who shall remain unnamed, but of one of the superpowers wanted to reach Mr. Radojic, they reached him through Mr. Vučić directly and successfully. So there is the question of whether the connection exists or not. So this kind of policy of appeasement that moved into active support for people like Vučić and active support by the U.S. government, also for the formation of government that you mentioned, both national and national government with Mr. Dodik, is very indicative of the approach that the Western powers are taking currently in the Balkans, which is essentially, I don't know if you ever played hide and seek game with a child. I always quote it as a kind of comparison to the kind of triumph of hope over experience that the Western powers are currently playing in the Western Balkans. Is when you play hide and seek with a child, they usually cover their eyes and assume if they cover their eyes and if they can't see you, that you can't see them as well. And I think that was the policy of the US and the European Union currently in the Western Balkans. If they cover their eyes to what is happening in the Balkans, then surely that is not happening at all if they can't see it, or if they're pretending not to see it or covering their own eyes. So what will be the repercussions for Bosnia and Herzegovina? I think nationalists will be encouraged. They already are. Extreme nationalists will be encouraged by the passivity. And there is another danger that even if the policy towards Serbia in relation to Kosovo changes by Brussels and Washington, D.C., it will, Bosnia and Herzegovina will still be compartmentalized and seen as a separate issue. And that's a problem. That's a problem that they assume that somehow by dealing with Kosovo and Serbia alone is separate from destabilizing factors in Bosnia and Herzegovina. When you said that rhetorical crisis is constantly happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I don't believe in the rhetorical crisis. Rhetorical crisis actually produces crisis, both in people's trust, in the number of young people who wish to leave, in the perception of political stability. We see decline in investment. We see decline of foreign investors' trust in the stability of the region. So the rhetorical instability caused by Dodik is actually something that we assumed with Trump, right? We just assumed that people can't possibly be thinking and acting upon all the things that they're saying, whereas I think they will. So I think we need to treat this crisis as a Western Balkans crisis, as a crisis that has a huge, huge security risk factor. And that we need to stop pretending that we are not seeing clear connections between the encouragement of destabilization of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Montenegro coming from Serbia. And there is essentially, and understand this may sound simplistic, but going back to the beginning of my speech, all instability does come from Belgrade, unfortunately, in the Western Balkans, and we need to treat the source of the issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sabina. I mean, speaking about hide and seek, I mean, my girls 6 and 10, as they used to play this game like all the time, and covering the eyes. But at the age of 4, the smaller one, or 3.5, she discovered basically when I open the eyes, I just see you, Daddy. So basically now here the question is when the West is gonna open the eyes according to you. And I mean, if I understand you well, basically the next step should be sanctioning and putting a much larger pressure on Dodik, creating deterrence and addressing basically the main cause of the instability, which sits and who sits, or I mean, however you want to put it, in Belgrade, at Andrićev Vjenec. Adi, now to you. I mean, you have been traveling quite intensively across the region recently. I think you just recently were in North Macedonia and in Albania, and you are quite frequently in Belgrade. So you basically follow the regional events quite closely and look obviously to your home country even more closely. The question would be the same, basically. What do you see as kind of a bigger kind of a regional events and constellations that are going to unfold now following the events in Kosovo? Is anything going to change? Is everything going to stay the same? And looking closely to Bosnia and Herzegovina, is your answer the same like Sabina's, or do we need a kind of medicaments prescribed that include a kind of a wider range of different medicamentations for different illnesses that we have?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. Second of all, it's hard to add something to what was already said. But I want to pick up, of course, I have to first address a bit Kosovo-Serbia situation before I can move to Bosnia and Herzegovina to make a couple of points. But I want to stick to what Wolfgang started and you continued with the triangle issue. But I want to talk about one other triangle. It's the triangle between Vučić, Kurti, and the West, US, EU, and UK. And I think there are significant changes that are happening in that triangle since Sunday that need to be taken into account when thinking about not just what's going to happen between Kosovo and Serbia, what's going to happen in the north of Kosovo, but also what are the consequences, potential consequences on Bosnia and Herzegovina. I want to start with Kurti. Just one point. I mean, he has for months now been telling us that unless there is Kosovo police in the north, unless there are Albanian mayors in the north with little to no power that they could have, the situation will erupt in violence, paramilitaries, potential invasion from Serbia, etc., etc. And many in the West, EU, US, UK, have been dismissing that possibility. They've been telling both in private meetings, but also in public that that the Kurti's approach is the wrong one. After Sunday, I think much of the West has waken up to a reality in which it seems that he was right by pointing to the fact that both not having police, not having some kind of mayors in the north would have made the scenario that was attempted on Sunday even easier to implement, and the consequences would have been potentially even worse. On the Vučić side, things have completely changed, I would say. I mean, for some of us, I think many here also on this, I know for Donika and maybe for some others as well, it has been clear for some years now that Vučić has a narrative for different audiences. I think in 2019, in April, we described it in our report where we called him the hypnotist. He simply has a potential to hypnotize the audience that he's talking to tell them what they want to hear, and to make them then translate his messages anywhere that they go. And I think on Sunday, what happened is that some people who have been hypnotized with an idea that Vučić either has a full grip of the north of Kosovo and can make both political and any other decision on their behalf, have waken up to the fact that either that's not true, or what his aims in the north are are completely other than what he has been telling them. So the fundamental question in the future of the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia when it comes to this part of the triangle, Vučić triangle, is what is Vučić for dialogue? What is his contribution to not just the dialogue, but to anything that might be coming from Belgrade? And the third part of the triangle is the EU, US, and the UK. There we have seen two major groups of people, those who have been warning us about the same things that Kurti has been warning us for several months, some for years, and those that were telling us that Vučić either has everything under control or that he doesn't have bad intention when it comes to North Kosovo and Kosovo. And I think both for Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, but also for Bosnia and Herzegovina, yes, it is the key to see what's going to happen in Serbia. It's key to see what is going to happen in Kosovo. How will the government in Pristina use the current situation or use the situation to achieve something, but also what will happen in Belgrade. We see that, Vučić is going into not just parliamentary elections, but also municipal elections, de facto making himself the only one with legitimacy in next months. In Serbia, he's basically adding fuel to what is happening. And I think on the EU, US, UK side, the major and decisive moment will be for the region, not just Kosovo, Serbia, but also for the rest of the region, to see who wins, let me put it like that, the battle of narratives over what's happening in the Western Balkans. That means, will we see those who have been saying that this kind of scenario is possible, those that have been warning that the hypnotist is hypnotizing quite a lot, not just in the region, but also in the West, that they prevail and that they take things in their control, and that they then become not just faces, but also part of the policies towards the region? Or will those who want to somehow, find a way to keep, to see this as one of the incidents, as one of the elements in the cycle of that we have been observing for the past couple of years, just continuing? And in that sense, the key from my point of view is the answer to the question: will we do everything that is necessary to make sure, first of all, that the violence doesn't repeat itself? In that sense, UK sending additional forces, KFOR sending additional forces is good. In that sense, it's crucially important that the Kosovo police stays in the north in some ways, that we don't go down the scenario that Donika was mentioning, that some have been calling for, and that is to see violence being used as a mean to achieve political goals, and that is to get the Kosovo's institutions out of the North Kosovo. That would be a terrible message, not just for Kosovo and Serbia, but also for Bosnia and Herzegovina. Second, will those perpetrators that have used violence to try to achieve political goals be sanctioned? That is key. President Vučić has been using Kumanovo incident in 2015 falsely, claiming that there was a pardon for the participants of that attack and that EU had a different approach than it actually had. Quite the contrary. Kumanovo incident actually shows that it's important to have people being, the perpetrators being punished, sanctioned, and in judicial ways. And I think that will be fundamental then also for Bosnia and Herzegovina. If you look at today's and the past week in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we'll see Milorad Dodik having two addresses. One is Budapest. He's been meeting with Orban today. He's running towards EU4 being taken over, command being taken over by Hungarian. He knows that without Russia there is no EU4. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, he knows that Brussels is interested in keeping EU4. He's using that. On the second, he's also been supporting Fico in Slovakia. He thinks that he won the elections, and he expects also further advantages to his own goals. So if we see what's happening in Banja Luka, they hold the keys not just to reforms in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that Sabina can say much more about how it's de facto almost impossible to adopt reforms without the consent from Republika of Srpska. On the second of all, he holds the keys of EU formation. in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he feels that not just Orban coming also with the EU presidency of Hungary, but also Fico potentially coming back as prime minister and a couple of other people, that his network is gaining ground, and all of that can then be translated into a misunderstood messages that actually same like last Sunday, that it's time to do something that could be wrong. In case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I think as in the case of Kosovo, I think that the US-UK policy towards the two countries needs to be such calibrated that it sends a clear message to Dodiks and perpetrators in North Kosovo that without them, EU has a policy, with or without them, EU has a policy towards the two countries. In case of Kosovo, that would mean, I think, for the sake of security and stability, to send a clear political message, accept both the applications for the Council of Europe and for the EU. It will be an enormous message, not just to Kosovo, but also to Serbia as well. And in case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's simply to stop this madness of Troika bashing and Troika is same or worse, and understanding the reality of Bosnia and Herzegovina today and finding ways to support Troika in what they are trying to do, successfully or less successfully, one can debate, and simply ask them what is it that they need, that they think they need in the next 6 to 8 months, and provide whatever that is.
Thank you so much, Adi. Just the general information. So I'm just going to ask Stefan a quick question regarding Bosnia and the West, and then would like to invite you all to pose your questions in the chat. So I already see one question on the outcome of the Serbian elections, but feel free to post questions, and we're gonna collect the questions and bring them back to the panel for the last quick round. So please think about interesting questions that you wanna ask our panelists. And now, Stefan, just a quick one to you. And Dodik, obviously, you can also just add on what has been said by other participants, and also Wolfgang wants to say something. But Adi just mentioned basically the growing network of semi-autocrats, despots, illiberals, and the hope that Vučić, Dodik, and others might have. Basically, we just need to wait long enough for, let's say, presidential elections in the States, or for some events in Poland now. I mean, we are facing elections, etc., etc. I mean, the question will be basically, given all the cleavages within the European Union, given Fico's victory right now, and the quick congratulations from Banja Luka and Belgrade, and obviously Orban, how realistic it is to expect the European Union to speak with one voice and to move towards this kind of a clear policy of, we are not going to continue appeasing autocrats, we're going to change the course, we're going to establish a credible deterrence. How do you see it right now unfolding? You are muted, Stefan.
Myself.
Yes, now we can.
I think it's quite difficult to be very optimistic, frankly. I think that the EU is relatively weak foreign policy player. That hasn't changed over the last 10, 15 years. And it can, at best, I think, deal with one challenge and one crisis at the time. And the primary challenge at the moment is still Ukraine. And I do believe that the EU feels some kind of responsibility of what happens on the Western Balkans, but the capacity and the leadership that is available to address these issues in a very forceful way is, I would think, relatively weak. Those who believe that the events of last Sunday is a game change, that now Serbia will be isolated and put under sanctions and under heavy pressure, I think they are they're quite unrealistic. I think one single event very rarely changes the overall picture. In order to adopt sanctions, the EU needs unanimity. Can you imagine Orban supporting sanctions against Serbia? I think it's very hard to imagine. So I think that to some extent, it was a reality check. I think the situation is taken more seriously by the Western countries. KFOR is being reinforced, and there will be stronger efforts to stabilize the situation in the north, but neither will the West suddenly fall in love with Prime Minister Kurti. I think he continues to be seen very, very critically, nor can I imagine that there will be very, very heavy pressure against Vučić at the moment. I think the dialogue will change. I think Lajčák certainly will not continue beyond the end of the mandate of this this institutional cycle. I think that he would probably be the first one to admit that that a new start will be needed. Also, probably a new high representative will be needed. I think, but there is a certain concern now that so relatively late before the next European Parliament elections, it's rather difficult. The institutions in a way are a bit tired, and to have the kind of mobilize the energy to have this new start now, I'm not totally confident. So altogether, I think there is a reality check. Certain things will change, but the people who believe that the EU policy towards the Western Balkans will change in a fundamental way over the next few months, I think are quite mistaken, unfortunately.
Stefan, I mean, if you buy into your argument of it's going to be more of the same, it's going to be, I think, a big disaster. But I know we can still discuss it. Dodik, I wanted to add something, and then also Wolfgang, and then we immediately go into questions. And I will ask you in the meantime, all the panel, just look into the questions in the chat. So then we make a kind of a final round. We don't want to exceed the time and take too much of audience this evening.
Oh yeah, there is a lot. Also, there are questions that I just saw. First of all, I mean, this is instability pockets installed by Vučić, and they are imploding. And you know, the one in northern part of Kosovo was one of them. I mean, Sunday happened prematurely. Sunday happened by accident because there was a police officer who just, you know, noticed something, a truck, and then, you know, one event led to another. And then, you know, we saw what was in the monastery. What if, you know, that had been an operation that was well thought and it would have happened when they were prepared for it to happen? That would have been disastrous. So it happened prematurely, and we were lucky because the police was lucky as well as NATO, because NATO did not have to intervene. Because when NATO intervenes, that's going to really be a lot. That's why I'm very careful when I say NATO should be more proactive on the ground. And I rather mention supporting Kosovo police and providing intelligence, because this is important. A second one, what I have noticed also, you know, by the, you know, Twitter community and all, trying to sort of detach this from Vučić by saying like, oh my God, but this is, you know, out of Vučić's control, because, you know, by default, this is, you know, sort of cornering Vučić, and, you know, like kind of feeling sorry. And at some point I saw even someone actually drawing parallels between Đinđić and Vučić, you know, which is, it was, you know, for me, it was impossible to sort of, you know, comprehend all that situation by saying like, oh, you know, we're talking about a country, and Vučić is under pressure. We're talking about a country that has killed a prime minister. But forgetting the fact that, you know, while there might not be direct links now in terms of who gave the order for Banska to happen, but, you know, Radojčić was, you know, close to Vučić. Vučić, you know, sort of created this environment which actually allowed these people to become who they are now. So, you know, like, we shouldn't forget about this. While we are searching for direct links, like who gave the order, to, you know, sort of go back to who actually made all of this happen, and you know, like, who is Radojčić linked to? Because, you know, going back to first local elections in the northern part of Kosovo, you know that the international community, but also, you know, Serbian government actually counted on Radojčić to mobilize people and go out and vote and integrate in the Kosovo system. So it was, you know, their players sort of going out of control. So, you know, we shouldn't feel sorry for, you know, someone who played with fire, you know, kind of got burned halfway through, and now we should, you know, just sort of justify Vučić, or try to sort of, you know, detach him from what happened in the northern part of Kosovo. The second one is, you know, like, who is being burned now? You know, because, you know, with Vučić being cornered, I mean, is he going to be the pro-West person who actually throws under the bus the person who is linked to Russia, like Radojcic and potentially Vulin, who is already blacklisted by the US. How is this game going to unfold in Serbia if, you know, Vučić wants to play the game to actually save himself, but sort of throw under the bus other people? And then, you know, this way proving to the West, especially to the US, that he is the one who is actually sort of now being freed from his, you know, the pro-Russian sort of elements who were pressuring him. So this is, you know, like all the game that he, you know, can play, but, you know, he just needs more time, obviously, because, I mean, there is this war in Ukraine and Russia is not sort of reliable. I mean, looking at what happened in Armenia, in Nagorno-Karabakh, obviously Russia is not a reliable partner. So like, you know, calculating on the steps and seeing, you know, how this situation will unfold, how strong Russia will remain or not, and then see how to play this East and West staying on the fence game. So this is something that, you know, like the West should pay attention to when they look at it. And then the last one is that, why is Vučić wanting the association for? Is it for the people, or is it for the political control of the North and Kosovo, and continuing to feed this instability pocket to sort of, you know, remain in power? Now we have to go back to the question, like, what do we need it for? What's his agenda, and how to negotiate with Vučić? For the EU is important, and US, and I'm really happy the UK is kind of getting more active because we lost them after the Brexit. What, you know, the question is, how far can we continue supporting Vučić? The other question is, continuing to sort of accommodate Vučić's needs by pressuring Kosovo. Is it really, you know, like a good strategy to follow? So no matter who is there, whether it's Lajčák, because we know that Lajčák is, you know, like one of the players, like, do we continue this form of negotiating by just pressuring on the weaker link in order to appease and you know, accommodate, you know, the stronger one? Or like, do we really change the situation on the ground and see, you know, listen to both parties and see what both parties have to say, and without, you know, calling one, you know, either crazy, because this was literally what I've heard in one of the meetings, that, you know, one party is dangerous, referring to Serbia, but the other one is crazy, that's Kosovo, you know, and this is, you know, basically how they refer to Kosovo. And to change this approach and really treat both parties as relevant, because we both are, it should be the same, and both parties should have a say in what is happening in the negotiations. So it's not about just, you know, sort of, because everybody's now is kind of happy that NATO is increasing its presence. That's not a good news. That's securitization of the Balkans. That's really, you know, going back to the 90s. That's not, we're not talking about reforms anymore. We're not talking about democratization. We're talking about preventive wars. This is going back to the 90s. So this shouldn't be good news for any of us. And this shouldn't be sort of welcomed as a good news. So and then, you know, like the last element, what is going to happen to Lista Srpska? In Kosovo, there is this debate whether we should declare it as a terrorist sort of organization. And then what will happen to not only elections in the north, because, you know, what happens with the 4 mayors who should have resigned, and we know that, you know, the elections were face-saving and it was a mistake and steps that Kosovo undertook at that point. But what will happen? Who's going to participate from the Serbs? Are the local Serbs really willing to even vote? Who is going to compete? I mean, Lista Srpska is not any kind of party. It's not just a party. They actually exercise pressure on other, you know, Serbs who actually want to independently run, either for mayors, local elections, or you know, elections, central elections in Kosovo. So I don't know how the future is going to look like, because it really depends on how now we are going to manage the situation. And it doesn't look good. And I said it before, you know, we're not talking, now negotiating is not starting from zero, starting from scratch. Now it's really starting from minus. And it doesn't look good at all, because back then we used to negotiate while the situation on the ground was peaceful. Now we're negotiating while the situation on the ground is tensed, and you know, with the Kosovo police being fully mobilized, but also NATO being like now even strengthening their presence in the north. And I don't know how Lajčák is going to continue to do this, but it is the right moment to actually not only be open about the direct links to Vučić, to Serbia, but also rethink the entire approach towards the dialogue, the both countries, but also the region.
Yeah, thanks, Dodik. A lot of interesting aspects. I mean, regarding Lajčák, I mean, there were rumors today in the morning that he might be in Fico's team as a foreign minister, which will be wonderful for Lajčák, and I don't know, probably equally wonderful for the Western Balkans. But I'm just moderating here. So the interesting questions in the chat. I mean, just one remark to the audience. Basically, if you have expected to have a nice, optimistic evening, you probably have chosen now the wrong discussion. So there's a lot of pessimism. But I mean, pessimism gives birth to interesting and important questions that we need to ask. And here comes one, and I'm going to ask this one to Sabina. Particularly, I mean, Stefan just mentioned basically his expectation that the EU is going to continue the business as usual to a certain extent with small adjustments. And Adrien de Montea just put a question in the chat saying, and I'm quoting him, "In my view, the EU is like the former Alitalia, always late in takeoff, always late in arrival." And Sabina, I think we should not forget to think closely about Bosnia and Herzegovina and events in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So what will be the consequence basically for Bosnia if the EU remains this Alitalia, on this Alitalia speed, firstly, and secondly, Donika just mentioned something utterly important. I mean, in this wave of securitization and crisis and hyper crisis, etc., or transactionalism from the Western side, we seem to have forgotten the basically what the whole story is about. Is it about democracy, rule of law, changes, reforms? Who's going to make them? And your coalition in Bosnia and Herzegovina embarked on a very ambitious reform agenda. What's going to happen with this one if we just continue riding Alitalia? Sabina.
In 2005, I graduated from the university, and my graduation thesis was on EU security policy. And although I was advocating for greater political and security integration of the EU, I then said as a 23-year-old that I won't live to see it. And I was a cocky, cynical 23-year-old, and now I'm cocky, cynical 43-year-old. No, 41-year-old, sorry. But still, unfortunately, we are still Alitalia. And I actually fully agree with Stefan. I don't think anything will change in terms of EU's security policy towards the Western Balkans. So when I was advocating for it, I wasn't doing it hopefully, or I wasn't doing it in a way that I expected it to happen. So I fully agree. Anyone who expects that the EU will make a U-turn is, I believe, completely wrong. That doesn't mean that the results won't be disastrous, and I think they will, increasingly so. At the same time, when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are things that the EU can do that are closer to its nature than what I would be advocating for, which is a more proactive security engagement. And that is really opening the doors more proactively towards Western Balkans as a matter of their security interest, as a matter of EU security interest. Even though we are in the kind of least hopeful coalition possible in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the reason why we did it and why we joined that coalition is because we realized nobody's coming to save us. Nobody's truly coming to either sanction fully Dodik, let alone what would be our dream politically taking him out. And in that regard, then you realize, wait a second, I'm going to spend my lifetime without EU becoming a political giant the way at least used to be an economic one. And in a sense, we need to take responsibility for the processes. But what we can, I think, and hopefully realistically, what we can ask for is not repeating the mistake that we saw in Albania and Northern Macedonia, and opening negotiations with Bosnia and Herzegovina based on the legislation that we did adopt. This coalition, as kind of devastating as it is, did adopt the key pieces of legislation, anti-corruption legislation, that are requirements, that were conditions for opening the negotiations. And then once if the negotiations are open, then if we have even a kind of perception of the EU path, then it becomes easier mitigating the voices that are openly pro-Putin, and that are destructive, and we are easier than in isolating these. It's easier to isolate these voices if we can get Croatian side on track, and if we can rebuild relations with Croatia, and if we can have a Croatian government advocating for opening the section talks with the EU, then in a sense we are isolating the most destructive factors and opening perception of kind of possibility and potential for Bosnia and Herzegovina, particularly kind of our youth, the middle class, the driving force of progress. We desperately need that good news from the EU, not to fall in full despair, as we indicated all the risk factors in this panel.
Okay, great. That means not waiting for Godot, but waiting for good news from the EU. Adi, just a quick last one. I mean, enlargement is back on the geopolitical agenda of the European Union, and whatever we think about the possible future of the region, I think societies that stop having a kind of a vision of itself or themselves in the future, they in a way cease to exist as a kind of a functional body. So basically, whatever we want to imagine, we need to imagine the Western Balkans within the framework of the European Union. And now with Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova, there is a new kind of urgency, geopolitical urgency. So my question is, you have been working on the EU enlargement so much now in this very difficult moment. I mean, against the background of what we have discussed so far, and Russian influence and events in Kosovo and crisis and Dodik, etc., etc. Is there any space for a new lease of life for the enlargement in the Western Balkans as a kind of a way towards this bright, shiny future?
Well, Stefan came back from Belgrade saying that we in the Western Balkans are cynical about the EU enlargement and what's happening in Brussels. The change, I would say, that what Stefan said in response to some of our suggestions on what the EU could do in the region is that the EU is still very cynical and doesn't believe that the Western Balkans, despite EU staying the same, does not change, and it changes to worse. When it comes to the space that the EU has, in particular in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I want to point out that quite often I get a question about Dodik is, why does he not do more? Why is Troika not more successful in convincing Dodik to do certain reforms? And for me, that's a misplaced question. I think the better question in the current circumstances, where EU is very weak, where we see how it reacted to developments in Caucasus, in Azerbaijan and Armenia. We've seen President Charles Michel, who's all over on reforming the EU enlargement process and introducing changes, has de facto, as Politico Europe announced, has seen a fiasco in his attempts to try to have any influence there. I think the question when it comes to Dodik in the past 8 months is, why has he accepted even so little to do the reforms and the things that Sabina has mentioned, and why does he insist, next to obviously being invited to go to Moscow and going to Moscow in November, and his people going to Moscow regularly in the past year and a half, why does he still desperately needs to be in Budapest, why he desperately needs to meet with Manuel Saracin in Banja Luka, why he desperately wants Fico to win? And the answer to that question would be very simple. Dodik and a couple of people around him have an alternative. They can go to Russia or somewhere else and survive. The citizens in Republika Srpska cannot. There is no alternative for them but the EU, and he needs to keep some kind of an impression. And how much he's afraid of his citizens shows also steps that he has done in the past 6 months when it comes to the rights, basically cutting the freedoms of media, cutting the freedoms of NGO sector, trying to influence the media. The things that that we've seen in Belgrade and in Serbia happening for years, we now see in Banja Luka happening in some extent even in much worse. It shows that he's afraid not just of his own citizens and voters, who according to some have actually voted him out in October, but he somehow miraculously won the elections. He's afraid of them. So if thinking about what's the EU's place in Bosnia and Herzegovina today, in light of everything that is happening, it's about actually understanding this sense that that prevails among the citizens of Republika Srpska, the Sabina Čudić and Sabina Čudić of Bosnia and Herzegovina politics today and the ruling coalition, and try to use that to not just strengthen them, but also to send a signal to citizens in Republika Srpska. When it comes to even enlargement policy, just one small remark. I think that it's wonderful that we have these discussions on revival of EU enlargement. I am not at all surprised or shocked that no one in Western Balkans is enthusiastic about EU's approach to Ukraine and Moldova, in the sense that they say, oh, look, suddenly something is changing, because we have seen countries getting candidate status, we have seen countries starting accession talks, but we haven't seen a single new EU member since 2013. And until there is a new EU member, the Western Balkans will not change in that sense. So I want to just send one appeal, and that is in December, if we have council conclusions which say we opened accession talks with Moldova and Ukraine, and we offer you some kind of a complicated process in which you will get a bit of more money, and your politicians and your civil servants will be able to take part in council and commission meetings, and we might open certain projects for you, will not do the things, it will not even begin to revive EU's credibility in the region. What we need in December is a clear commitment from the EU that if the countries in the region do the reforms, and those countries that do reforms, that despite what's going to happen in the EU, they will they will be able to enjoy what the EU privileges, or what is that the EU as a privilege offers, be it for freedoms, be it the customs union, be it, Schengen, all these different aspects. And I think without something like that, we will end up in next year discussing the issue all over again.
Thank you so much, Adi. I'm just looking at the time. So before my kids start asking me to play hide and seek the last time before they go to bed, and before we just continue too long, I would suggest, that we just stop here. I think we shed light on and brought a bit light into many very difficult and complex constellations in the Western Balkans tonight. We even managed to mention the name Vučić the most. I was just counting, it was 227 times that we mentioned Vučić. So if he was listening, he will be happy and his ego will be fine. So don't forget the egos of male autocrats in the Western Balkans. But on a serious side, I think a number of important points were made in how to deal or how to stop appeasing autocrats, how to change the course, how to offer possible alternatives. It was not the most optimistic evening, I have to say, but it was a very sober assessment of what is at stake. And as the events are simply too fast right now and so much is unfolding in front of our eyes, I hope it was an interesting possibility for you from the audience to listen. We didn't manage to answer all the questions. So if you have any specific additional questions, you can send me an email, or to Adi, Donika, Stefan, and Sabina. I'm quite sure they're gonna be happy to answer this email. Just one last remark before I say good night and start playing seek and hide. The conversation will be on YouTube from tomorrow or Wednesday at latest onwards. So if you want to share it, and if you want to just inform some other experts or colleagues that missed the discussion today, so you are very much invited to do so. Thank you so much, Donika. Thank you so much, Sabina, Adi, and Stefan. Thank you, Wolfgang, for joining us tonight, being with us. Thank you all for listening. Wish you a good night, and we all go and play our seek and hide for tonight. All the best.
Bye bye. Thank you for having us.